Hey guys, how are you all? Hope you all are fine and enjoying your life. Today we are back with another Reddit true off-the-chest story with Minecraft gameplay. So just sit, relax, and enjoy. I'm watching my stepmom become the loser she always told me I'd become, and it's amazing. I'm currently sitting in my parked car outside a rundown studio apartment in a part of town I usually avoid, watching my stepmother, Diane, struggle to carry 3 heavy grocery bags up a flight of rusted metal stairs. One of the bags just ripped, sending a carton of cheap eggs and a bottle of generic dish soap shattering across the concrete. And honestly, I haven't felt this much peace in years. Most people would call me cruel for enjoying the sight of a 50-year-old woman crying over spilled groceries. But most people didn't grow up with Diane. For 15 years, she was the architect of my misery, the woman who took every opportunity to tell me I was a worthless, lazy mistake who would eventually end up rotting in the gutter. She spent a decade trying to manifest my failure like it was her full-time job, and now, through a series of events she never saw coming, I'm the one with the 6-figure career and the stable life, while she's living the exact nightmare she designed for me. To understand why this feels like justice, you have to understand who Diane was when she married my father. I was 8 years old when she entered the picture, and at the time, she was the epitome of suburban perfection. She was polished, articulate, and carried herself with this aura of extreme superiority that made everyone in our neighborhood feel like they were constantly being auditioned for her approval. My dad was a successful civil engineer, a kind but passive man who was so blinded by her charm that he didn't notice the mask slipping whenever he left the room. From the very first month, Diane made it her mission to correct me. She didn't like my grades, she didn't like my hobbies, and she especially didn't like the fact that I reminded her of my biological mother, who had passed away 2 years prior. Diane's favorite weapon wasn't shouting or physical discipline. It was the prophecy. That's what I called it. Every time I made a mistake, whether it was spilling a glass of juice or getting a B- on a math quiz, she would sit me down and speak in this calm, terrifyingly cold voice. She'd tell me that I had loser DNA, and that without her constant intervention, I would end up as a burden on society. She'd say things like, "Look at you, Mark, you have no discipline, no drive, and no class. You're going to be 30 years old, working a dead-end job, living in a shoebox, and wondering where it all went wrong. And when that day comes, don't you dare come crawling back to us." She repeated this so often that it became the soundtrack of my childhood. She convinced my father that I was a troubled youth who needed strict boundaries, which was really just code for her controlling every aspect of my life while systematically stripping away my self-esteem. By the time I was in high school, Diane had successfully isolated me from my dad. She handled the finances, the social calendar, and the parenting. If I wanted to go out with friends, she'd find a chore I hadn't done to her exact specifications and ground me for a week. She'd tell my dad I was being defiant or sneaking around, and because he wanted peace at home, he just nodded and let her handle it. I remember one specific night during my senior year when I got my acceptance letter to a decent state university. I was so proud, thinking I finally had a ticket out of that house. But when I showed it to them at dinner, Diane didn't even look up from her salad. She just sighed and told my dad that it was a waste of money because I'd probably flunk out within the first semester and end up working at a gas station. She literally looked me in the eye and said, "I hope you like the smell of gasoline, Mark, because that's the only future someone with your work ethic can expect." The psychological warfare was constant, and for a long time, I actually believed her. I went to college with this massive weight on my shoulders, waiting for the moment I would inevitably fail because that's what I'd been told would happen for half my life. But a funny thing happened once I was away from her. Without Diane constantly whispering in my ear that I was a failure, I actually started to thrive. I worked 2 jobs, I studied until my eyes bled, and I pushed myself harder than anyone else because I was terrified of her being right. I graduated with honors, landed a junior analyst role at a firm in Chicago, and slowly started building a life that had nothing to do with the loser Diane had envisioned. While I was building my life, Diane was busy perfecting hers. She had turned our family home into a monument to her ego, spending my father's hard-earned money on expensive renovations, designer clothes, and high-end social clubs. She loved being the charity chairwoman and the woman who had the perfect husband and the perfect house. She looked down on everyone, the waiters at her favorite restaurants, the neighbors with slightly unkempt lawns, and especially her disappointing stepson. Whenever I came home for the holidays, which I did less and less, she would spend the entire time subtly digging at my career, calling my hard work cute, and reminding me that I was only one mistake away from losing everything. She never saw the irony that she hadn't worked a single day since marrying my father. The cracks started to show about 4 years ago, though I didn't realize it at the time. My father's health began to decline, and instead of stepping up to care for him, Diane became increasingly resentful that his illness was interfering with her social life. She started complaining about the cost of his medications and how draining it was to deal with his doctor appointments. I started noticing things were off during my visits. The house wasn't as spotless as it used to be, and Diane seemed perpetually agitated, always clutching a glass of wine even in the middle of the afternoon. She was still arrogant, still condescending to me, but there was a flicker of desperation in her eyes that I couldn't quite place. Then, 3 years ago, my father passed away. It was a heart attack, sudden and devastating. In the midst of my grief, I expected Diane to be a wreck, but she was strangely focused on the logistics, specifically the will. She didn't even wait for the funeral to be over before she started talking about liquidating assets and moving on to the next chapter. She felt so secure in her position, so certain that my father had left everything to his devoted wife, while leaving his unreliable son a token pittance. She actually pulled me aside after the service and told me, with a straight face, that I should probably start looking for a cheaper apartment because she wouldn't be able to subsidize my lifestyle anymore, even though I hadn't taken a dime from them in years. What Diane didn't know, and what my father had kept secret from her for the last 5 years of his life, was that he wasn't as oblivious as he seemed. My dad might have been passive, but he wasn't stupid. He had seen how she treated me, and more importantly, he had seen how she spent money. He had quietly consulted with a lawyer and a forensic accountant after catching Diane in a series of financial irregularities involving his retirement accounts. He didn't divorce her because he was old, tired, and didn't want the drama, but he did change his will. He set up a series of trusts and protections that ensured the bulk of his estate, the house, the investments, and the life insurance, was tied up in ways Diane couldn't touch without my oversight, or was left directly to me. The day the will was read was the first time I saw the mask truly shatter. We were sitting in a sterile law office, Diane dressed in a black designer suit that probably cost more than my first car, looking like she was ready to collect her prize. When the lawyer explained that the house was to be sold and the proceeds placed into a trust that only paid out a modest monthly stipend to Diane, provided she met certain behavioral and financial stability requirements, she actually shrieked. And when it was revealed that I was the primary beneficiary of the remaining estate and the executor of her trust, the look of pure, unadulterated rage on her face was something I'll never forget. She didn't cry for my father. She screamed at the lawyer, called my dad a senile old fool, and then turned her venom on me, accusing me of manipulating him in his final days. I didn't say a word. I just sat there and watched her realize that the power dynamic had completely flipped. She wasn't the queen anymore, and I wasn't the loser she could kick around. For the first time in my life, I held all the cards, and Diane was looking at a future that didn't include country clubs or 5-star vacations. She walked out of that office swearing she would sue me for everything I had, but the truth was, she didn't have the money for a high-powered legal battle. My dad had been very thorough. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that if he left her everything, she'd be broke in 5 years, and if he left her nothing, she'd be a martyr. So he left her just enough to survive, but not enough to be the person she pretended to be. The fallout was immediate. Within 6 months, the big house was sold. Diane had to move into a rental, but she insisted on a luxury apartment she couldn't afford, convinced she could win in court and get her old life back. She spent her monthly stipend on lawyers and expensive clothes to maintain appearances, neglecting her bills and her future. I watched from a distance as she burned through her small savings, waiting for the reality to sink in. She stopped calling me to insult me and started calling me to demand loans or advances from the trust, which I denied every single time, citing the very strict rules my father had put in place. Every time she'd call, she'd try a different tactic. One day she was the grieving widow who just needed a little help to get through a tough month. The next, she was the protective mother figure who had only ever wanted the best for me. When those didn't work, the old Diane would return, spitting vitriol and telling me I was a cold-blooded monster who was enjoying watching her suffer. And honestly, I wasn't enjoying it yet. I was just indifferent. I was busy with my own life, my own career, and a woman I had met who actually loved me for who I was, not for what I could do for her social standing. But then, the lawsuits failed. The luxury apartment evicted her for non-payment. Her friends from the social clubs vanished the moment she couldn't pay the dues or host the parties. Diane was left with nothing but her pride and the small monthly check that barely covered a studio apartment and basic groceries. She had to get a job for the first time in decades, and because she had no skills and a massive ego, she couldn't keep anything for more than a month. She worked retail, but got fired for being abusive to customers. She tried being a receptionist, but couldn't handle taking orders from people younger than her. Which brings us back to today. I'm sitting here in my car, watching her pick up the broken eggs from the sidewalk. She looks haggard. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed, is thin and graying at the roots because she can't afford the high-end salon anymore. Her clothes are dated and starting to fray. She's currently arguing with a neighbor who's telling her to clean up the mess, and the way she's waving her arms, her voice cracking as she tries to maintain that old lady of the manor authority, is just pathetic. She's become the very person she warned me I would be, a bitter, struggling person living in a cramped space, wondering where it all went wrong. The prophecy came true. She just got the names mixed up. And the best part? This is only the beginning of her realization that the world doesn't owe her anything. Watching Diane struggle with her groceries was a turning point for me, a moment where the indifference I had tried to maintain finally gave way to a dark, satisfying sense of irony. I didn't leave immediately after she went inside her building. I sat there for another 20 minutes, just absorbing the reality of the scene. This was the woman who once made me scrub the baseboards of our 4-bedroom house with a toothbrush because she found a speck of dust. Yet there she was, living in a place where the hallways smelled like stale grease, and the landlord probably hasn't painted since the 90s. It felt like the universe was finally correcting a long-standing error in the books. A few days later, I received a series of frantic voicemails from her. This was her new pattern. She'd go weeks without contact, trying to prove she didn't need me, and then something would break, literally or figuratively, and she'd spiral. This time, her car had broken down. It was an old Lexus she'd managed to keep from the marriage, but it was a money pit she couldn't maintain. In the messages, her voice went from a shaky, manufactured sweetness to a jagged, desperate edge. "Mark, honey, it's Diane. I'm in a bit of a bind with the car, and I know your father would want you to help me. It's just a few $100s for the alternator. Please, call me back." By the third message, she was screaming, "You're doing this on purpose. You're watching me drown. I hope you're happy, you little sociopath." I didn't call her back. Instead, I sent a formal email through the trust's legal portal, stating that the trust did not cover unforeseen luxury vehicle repairs and suggesting she look into public transportation. I knew that would sting more than a phone call ever could. For Diane, the idea of a bus was like the idea of leprosy. It was something that happened to those people, not to her. I could almost picture her face as she read that email, her veins popping in her neck, realizing that her power over me had evaporated into digital text and legal barriers. A week later, I decided to check in on her employment status. I had a friend who worked in HR at a local department store where I'd heard she'd managed to land a job in the fragrance department. I didn't want to interfere, but I couldn't resist the urge to see her in the wild, as it were. I walked into the store on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing a tailored suit from my own successful career, looking every bit the man she said I'd never be. I spotted her behind the Chanel counter. She looked exhausted. The bright, artificial lights of the store weren't kind to her. They highlighted every wrinkle and the puffiness under her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping, or she was drinking too much. I watched from behind a display of handbags as she tried to sell a bottle of perfume to a young woman who couldn't have been more than 22. The girl was being a bit indecisive, and I saw Diane's jaw tighten. That old Diane glare was there, the one that used to make me shrink into myself. She was trying so hard to be the sophisticated saleswoman, but her frustration was bubbling over. When the girl finally said she wanted to think about it and started to walk away, Diane snapped. I couldn't hear the exact words, but I saw her hiss something at the girl's back. The girl turned around, shocked, and immediately headed for the manager's office. I stayed long enough to see the manager come out, pull Diane aside, and lead her to the back. 10 minutes later, Diane walked out of the employee break room with her coat and a small plastic bag of her belongings. She'd been fired. Again, as she walked toward the exit, she passed right by me. She didn't see me at first. Her head was down, her shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before. But then, she looked up and our eyes met. For a split second, I saw a flash of the old, arrogant Diane. She tried to pull her shoulders back and lift her chin, but it crumbled instantly. She looked terrified that I had seen her fall. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice sounding small. "What are you doing here?" "Just shopping, Diane," I said, my voice calm and pleasant. "I didn't know you worked here. Or, used to work here, I guess." Her face went from pale to a deep, blotchy red. "I was quitting anyway. This place is beneath me. The management is incompetent, and the clientele is just low class." "Right?" I replied, nodding slowly. "It's always everyone else, isn't it? Never the common denominator." She stepped closer to me, her breath smelling faintly of peppermint and something sharper, like gin. "You think you're so high and mighty, don't you? Standing there in your expensive suit, looking down at me. You're just like your father, smug and cold. You're enjoying this. You're actually enjoying seeing me like this." "I'm just watching the prophecy unfold, Diane," I told her, and the words felt like silk. "Remember? You told me I'd be the one in the dead-end job. You told me I'd be the one wondering where it all went wrong. It turns out, you were just describing your own future. I'm just a witness." She lunged at me then, not to hit me, but to grab my lapels, her fingers trembling. "I made you. I gave you structure. You'd be a drug addict in a ditch if it wasn't for me. You owe me, Mark. You owe me a life." I gently unhooked her hands and stepped back. Several people in the store were staring now, and a security guard started moving toward us. "I don't owe you anything but the monthly check the trust provides. And based on your current behavior, I might have to talk to the lawyer about whether you're meeting the stability requirements. You look a bit unstable, Diane." The look of pure, unadulterated fear that crossed her face was the best thing I'd ever seen. She realized that I wasn't just a passive observer anymore. I was the one who could tighten the leash. She backed away, stumbling slightly, and then turned and ran out of the store. I stood there for a moment, feeling a strange mix of adrenaline and a weird, hollowed-out kind of pity. Not the kind of pity that makes you want to help, but the kind you feel for a wounded animal that's spent its life biting people. Over the next month, Diane's life continued to unravel at an accelerated pace. She lost her car to the bank, which meant she finally had to take the bus. She started calling my office, trying to get past my secretary, claiming it was a family emergency. When I finally took one of the calls, she sounded completely different. The aggression was gone, replaced by a haunting, hollow tone. She told me she was hungry. She told me she had spent her entire stipend in the first week on debts and didn't have enough for food. "I can't help you with extra cash, Diane," I said, leaning back in my office chair. "But I can send you a list of local food banks. I hear the one on 4th Street is very organized." "A food bank?" she choked out. "Mark, I'm your mother." "No," I said firmly. "You're the woman who married my father and spent 15 years trying to break me. My mother is buried in the cemetery you haven't visited in a decade. If you're hungry, go to the food bank. Or get a job you can actually keep. It's called work ethic, remember? You used to talk about it all the time." I hung up before she could respond. A few days later, I got a call from the police. Diane had been arrested for shoplifting. She tried to steal a bottle of expensive wine and some high-end face cream from a grocery store. When they caught her, she apparently told them she was the executor of a multi-million-dollar estate and that they were making a huge mistake. They didn't believe her, obviously. I had to go down to the station to post her bail, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't want the family name dragged through the mud more than necessary. When she walked out of the holding cell, she looked like a ghost. Her skin was sallow, her clothes were wrinkled, and she seemed to have aged 10 years in a single night. We sat in my car in silence for a long time. I expected her to scream or cry, but she just stared out the window at the neon sign of a nearby diner. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I did everything right. I was the one with the vision. I was the one who kept everything together. How did you end up with everything, and I ended up with this? Because you were so busy building a cage for me that you didn't notice you were building a trap for yourself, I told her. You relied on my father's money and my father's kindness to feel powerful. When he died, you had no foundation of your own. You're not a loser because of bad luck, Diane. You're a loser because you never learned how to be a real person without someone to look down on. She turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw no fire in her eyes. Just a vast, empty darkness. What happens now? Now, I said, starting the engine. Now you go back to your studio apartment. You go to your court date. You try to keep your next job. And you live the life you predicted for me. I'm going home to my wife, Diane. We're having dinner with friends tonight. People who actually like us. I dropped her off at her building and didn't look back. But as I drove away, I realized that the amazing feeling of watching her fall was starting to change. It wasn't just about the revenge anymore. It was about the realization that she was truly, fundamentally broken. She hadn't just lost her money. She had lost her identity. Without her status, she was nothing. And watching her realize that she was nothing was more powerful than any amount of money or any suit I could ever wear. However, the story didn't end there. About 2 weeks after the shoplifting incident, I received a frantic call from her landlord. Apparently, there was a situation at the apartment. When I arrived, the hallway smelled like smoke. Diane had tried to cook something on a hot plate since she hadn't paid her gas bill and had accidentally started a small fire. She wasn't hurt, but the apartment was a mess and the landlord was done. He was evicting her on the spot. I found her sitting on the curb, surrounded by the few things she still owned. She was clutching a framed photo of her and my father from a vacation they took to Paris 10 years ago. She looked up at me as I approached, and for a second, I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. She thought I was there to rescue her. She thought this was the moment where the movie version of the story kicks in, where the protagonist forgives the villain and takes them in. Mark, she said, her voice cracking. I have nowhere to go. Please, just for a few days. I'll do anything. I'll clean. I'll stay out of the way. I looked at her, then at the charred remains of her apartment building, then back at her. I thought about all those nights I spent crying in my room because she told me I was a failure. I thought about the way she treated my father in his final months. I thought about the prophecy. I know a shelter, I said quietly. It's not far from here. It's clean, and they'll help you get on your feet. A shelter, she gasped, the horror returning to her face. You'd put me in a shelter? I'm not putting you anywhere, Diane, I said, turning back toward my car. You put yourself here. I'm just giving you the address. As I drove away, I saw her in my rearview mirror, a small, lonely figure on a dirty sidewalk, clutching a photo of a life that was never really hers. I realized then that the final stage of her transformation wasn't just her becoming a loser. It was her becoming invisible. The woman who once commanded every room she entered was now just another person on the street that people walked past without a second glance. And as I turned the corner, I felt the last bit of weight from my childhood finally lift off my shoulders. The story was over. Or so I thought. The shelter wasn't the end of Diane's story, though it was the end of the Diane I used to know. For a few months, I heard nothing. I had blocked her number, and I told the lawyer to only contact me if there was a legal emergency regarding the trust. I threw myself into my work and my marriage, finally feeling like the ghost of my childhood had been exorcised. My wife, Sarah, was incredible through all of it. She knew the history, she'd seen the scars, and she never judged me for the coldness I showed Diane. She understood that sometimes the only way to survive a person like that is to let them face the consequences of their own soul. But then, about 6 months after I left her on that curb, I got a call from a social worker named Elena. She told me that Diane had been admitted to a state psychiatric facility after a public episode in a downtown park. Apparently, she'd been found wandering around in a tattered evening gown, one of the few things she'd kept from her old life, trying to invite strangers to a gala that didn't exist. She was malnourished, dehydrated, and completely disconnected from reality. She keeps asking for the executor, Elena told me over the phone. She's not making a lot of sense, but your name is on her emergency contact list from the trust documents. We need someone to sign off on her long-term care plan. I felt a surge of familiar frustration. Even in her complete collapse, she was still finding a way to tether herself to me. I debated just saying no, letting the state handle it, but there was a nagging sense of duty, not to her, but to my father. He'd left me in charge of her for a reason. Maybe he knew she'd end up here. Maybe he knew I was the only one who could actually make the hard decisions. I drove to the facility on a rainy Tuesday. It was a bleak, gray building that felt more like a prison than a hospital. When they led me into the visiting room, I didn't recognize her at first. She was sitting in a plastic chair, staring at a blank wall. She'd lost a significant amount of weight, and her skin had a translucent, papery quality. She wasn't wearing the evening gown anymore. She was in a standard-issue hospital gown. The Queen Diane I had feared for 15 years was gone. In her place was a fragile, broken old woman who looked like she could be blown away by a stiff breeze. "Diane," I said, sitting down across from her. She slowly turned her head. It took a few seconds for her eyes to focus on me, but when they did, something strange happened. There was no rage, no arrogance, no prophecy. There was just a quiet, terrifyingly lucid recognition. "Mark," she said, her voice thin and raspy. "You're late. The guest will be here soon, and the catering hasn't arrived. Did you check the linens? I told you the linens have to be Egyptian cotton." "There are no guests, Diane," I said gently. "You're in a hospital." She blinked, and for a moment, the delusion flickered. She looked around the room, at the barred windows and the peeling paint, and a look of profound sadness washed over her. "Oh, right. The hospital. I forgot." We sat in silence for a while. It was the first time in my life I'd ever sat with her without feeling like I was being hunted. "The social worker says you need a long-term plan," I told her. "The trust has enough to pay for a decent assisted living facility. Not a luxury one, but somewhere safe. Somewhere where they'll make sure you eat and take your medicine." She looked at her hands, which were trembling. "Will I have my own room?" "Yes," I said. "A small one, but it'll be yours." She nodded slowly, then looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, genuine curiosity. "Why are you doing this? After everything I said, everything I did, why didn't you just let me stay in the park?" I looked at her, and the answer came to me with surprising clarity. "Because if I let you rot in the park, then you were right about me. You told me I was a loser, a monster, someone with no class and no soul. If I acted like you, then I'd be proving you right. By making sure you're taken care of, even if it's from a distance, I'm proving that I'm nothing like you." She flinched as if I'd struck her. It was the final realization. She had spent my entire life trying to drag me down to her level of bitterness and narcissism, and she had failed. My success wasn't just in my job or my bank account. It was in the fact that I had remained a decent person despite her best efforts to ruin me. "I was so afraid," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I was so afraid that if you weren't a failure, then I was. If you were strong and capable, then what did that make me? I had to make you small so I could feel big. I thought that's how the world worked. You're either the one wearing the boots or the one being stepped on." "I know," I said, "but you were wrong. The world is a lot bigger than that. And now, you have to live in the world you built." I signed the papers that afternoon. I moved her into a modest assisted living facility in a quiet suburb. It's a clean place, with a small garden and a library. It's exactly the kind of average life she used to mock. I set it up so the trust pays the facility directly, and she gets a tiny allowance for personal items. I don't visit her. I don't call. I get a monthly report from the director letting me know she's stable. The last time I saw her was the day she moved in. I was helping the movers bring in a few boxes of her remaining things. As I was leaving, she stopped me in the hallway. She looked better, cleaner, more presentable, but the spark of Diane was completely extinguished. "Mark?" she called out. I stopped but didn't turn around. "Yes. You were always a good boy," she said. It was the most blatant lie she'd ever told, a desperate, last-ditch effort to rewrite history so she could die feeling like she wasn't a villain. Or maybe, in her broken mind, she actually believed it. "Goodbye, Diane," I said, and I walked out the door. That was a year ago. My life has continued to move forward in ways I never thought possible. Sarah and I just found out we're expecting our first child, a boy. When I found out, my first thought wasn't about the money I'd save for his college or the house we'd buy. My first thought was about the words I would use with him. I realized that the prophecy ends with me. I will never tell him he's a loser. I will never tell him he has bad DNA. I will never make him feel like he has to be perfect to be loved. Every now and then, I'll be driving through the city and I'll pass a bus stop or a cheap apartment complex, and I'll think of Diane. I'll think about how she's probably sitting in her small room right now, looking at that photo of Paris, wondering how she became the person she always despised. There's still a part of me that finds it amazing, but not in the way I expected. It's not a loud, cheering kind of amazing. It's a quiet, heavy kind of amazing. It's the awe you feel when you see a massive, ancient tower finally crumble under the weight of its own flawed foundation.